think about that space. So that's sort of where that's one of the ideas that I had through that. There's also this thing called Salty Shakespeare, where people are performing. It's a group of actors, and a lot of these things they're not like highly funded or anything like that. It's just people coming together and sort of doing things in public spaces and taking those spaces back. But the Salty Shakespeare thing is like for people who don't have Shakespeare in their classrooms or what have you, or maybe don't even think about it, but they stage these Shakespeare and they're quick things, like almost like flash mob performances, but they're like 3 minutes in downtown LA, so that people are walking by and all of a sudden they see Shakespeare happening, and it's people who are older, younger, kids, it's all types of people. So they're essentially trying to share the idea in this public space with other people that may not be part of that Shakespeare world.
Right.
So, and then there's a correlation, because you brought up the question as to whether or not these interventions are ways for artists to do art without needing lots of funding, and that this is serving underserved neighborhoods. There's a kind of overlappingness in many of the projects of
The Shakespeare is part of the school curriculum.
it is. Salty Shakespeare is?
Well, Shakespeare in general.
Yeah.
You can't get
Yeah, so she asked an interesting question in here. Is there a correlation in the reduction of crime when art in unexpected contested spaces is present? And you were looking at data and trying to do the overlap of data, which could be interesting.
Could be fun to answer that. What I like about how you pose this is that in a way, one of the challenges of this story is that we want to make explicit that what a contested space is, right? And that the fact that there are these spaces around us that are contested that people probably, often don't even know. Like going back to Reed's idea of the little park, which becomes the Bark Park, or that gets used for different purposes than what they were intended. So in a way, it's sort of if we sort of throw out this idea of contested space, sort of we have to define it in some way. We have to show a kind of a context for it, which this, in a sense, these artists are actually out there trying to do, is to set a context for it.
Yeah.
That's great. Sort of related to that is, what was it? Well, the arts pop-ups is kind of related to that.
Yeah, in the arts pop-ups, I also kind of wanted to look more at sort of the economic cross-section of, arts pop-ups, and, we hear a lot about retail pop-ups, but, with the arts pop-ups, are people really, how are the artists really benefiting or not benefiting from this? How are they sort of changing the types of art that they create because they're doing these pop-up shops? Is there such a thing as nomadic, artists who sort of travel from pop-up to pop-up and make their living just off of that? So I really kind of wanted to look at that from both a space perspective and then also an artist perspective of how being in a different space sort of influences them in both a creative way and an economic way.
Okay. Sam, I was immediately struck by your Grand Park idea, particularly in light of the story this week about permits. Did you see that?
I did that.
A typical filming permit in the city is $400 or something.
Oh, that I did see, yeah,
They
that's
want
like
$20,000 for
yeah.
that, right? So basically you're determining.
Was driving out, yeah, they say don't drive out the film industry because.
Yeah, but see, it's that actually to me is sort of like a much bigger issue. Is sort of like who has access to a space and how we sort of publicly define who gets to have access, how much you pay, right? So they're talking about the film industry being priced out of this, but it's also it also sort of speaks to that larger issue. Like I think, for instance, when like presidential event happens and how they segregated everybody 3 blocks away, right? They're all public streets, but no, they're not public during that point where where the president happens to be, right? So like this changing idea of access that we have to public spaces, which are presumably public spaces, right? But talk a little bit about the Grand Park.
Well, what I was, after talking with you last week, I guess everyone has probably been to Grand Park at this point. It's this big park in the Civic Center area. And it's revitalized everything that kind of used to be there. And so this is a very contemporary take on urban design, where instead of trying to impose a purpose for the park in some sense, they're trying to basically make it as user-friendly as possible. So to me, that's reminiscent of the climate of the internet, where everything is supposed to be customizable, where if you crowdsource enough, then people will make their own purpose of the tools that they're given. So if you look at the park, I mean, they've talked a lot about this. There's this magenta furniture that's movable. So you can create your own experience based on where you elect to move your furniture. You're not just falling into the planner's predetermined purpose for you when you're in that park. So to me, that was really interesting. And I had this idea, and I don't know if it's like gimmicky, I don't even know if it's feasible, but wouldn't it be cool to see how people are actually using the park? Are they taking advantage of its customizable capacities, or is it just kind of a flop? Because it is still very much in the Civic Center area, and it's, maybe that's foreboding to people that don't really know about it. So my idea would be to somehow track where the furniture actually moves, because it does move around. So could we use like GPS to like follow the furniture? A, is it being used? B, is it moving? And then that kind of creates like it kind of bridges the in-person to the virtual experience of the park, where you can
Like
see-
time-lapse photography from.
Right.
well, and then
Right. The
that's
security, is there security cameras? Can you watch the furniture?
well, that's what I said. Is like, well, if that doesn't work out, because obviously that's a lot to coordinate. You could do kind of speed up footage, so
Yeah.
you could really compress it, and then watch these things move or not move, which would be a really boring video.
Unless you
Look at a
really
bunch of
sped it
still
up.
furniture, yeah.
Well, if you want to be creative and sneaky about it, you could get like a GoPro camera or something.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like these little
It's the
HD
thing I used on
cameras.
my head computer project.
You could like camo it, put it up in a tree, do time lapse for like a day, and just see where the
See if
furniture
anything
moves.
happens.
Yeah, and that kind of thing.
So the thing I like about this is this is a declared public space, right, for everybody. And they made a whole set of assumptions about what a public space ought to look like and how people might use it, right? Which may or may not prove to be true.
And it's too, I mean, it's obviously, it only had its grand opening this past weekend. It started opening in July. So, I mean, by November 18th or whatever, it's going to be a little early to declare its future.
But still, no, I don't think it's about declaring its future. I think it's about how people encounter the park and decide how they want to use it or not use it.
Right.
Right? This is sort of related to your story, Ricky, the Percent for Art story,
Yeah.
in which it's sort of a very top-down model. It's a very traditional model of commissioning art for public purpose. Talk about that a bit?
Yeah.
Can I just say something about the furniture thing?
Yeah.
So I think for decades and centuries, around the world, parks had movable furniture. And then there was a moment when a lot of that furniture was stolen. And so it got bolted down. And now I think there are new security methods and means through miniaturization, And so it's, and what it really gets to is, you talk about customizable, it gets to the idea of what is allowed in this park, how much power does the user have? And it'd be very interesting to see what is allowed in that park and what is not allowed in that park. Who's allowed?
As far as other regulations are concerned.
Yeah.
Because
Can you
the
can you
designers
have a
have-
political rally in that park? A protest? What can you do? What can't you do? Yeah.
Is there some ways in which it's meant to discourage even that kind of activity in favor of other kind of activity, leisure
Right.
activity? I mean, the park is an experiment in social engineering.
Yeah.
Like Music Center was when it was built 40 years ago. I think this is a terrific idea. The thing is, I think tracking the furniture. I can even imagine film that would use not only something we shot, but also there are cameras trained.
Right.
And it's like there are people observing that for very different purposes. But in addition to tracking the furniture, I'd love to track the people
Right.
and get them to tell their stories. I think that the furniture might be a great component, a package of stuff that we could put together. And just jumping in, Doug, Ricky, where you were headed, listening to the group and sort of seeing the direction, we're sort of searching, it seems, for all these stories for some kind of dichotomies to frame this in. One that I've heard over and over again is this idea of, sort of people, self-empowerment through technology, the whole do-it-yourselfer aesthetic, the idea that, instead of giving people pedagogy, which is essential, as you were saying, Max and stuff, like opera, classical music, you can't just kind of learn that very easily on your own. But the thing I hear so much in everything I cover, especially music and film, is that new technology has changed everything. It has made it easier to go out and become a filmmaker, the red camera, turntables, software, all this stuff. And I think that applies sort of across the board here, framing all of these stories, the same kind of thing. It's like, I love the analogy you're making with the internet. It's like, you guys know how to customize stuff for yourself, so we'll give you the basic tools here, but then you go out and figure it out. But we'll see how that really works in practice. How much liberty do you really have? If I wanted to take those, pink benches that are so artistic and stack them on top of each other, what would happen to me then? Or whatever. Or if I decided to hang, a poster on one that said, Mitt Romney sucks or Obama sucks. How far would I get? And what if I said, I'm an artist? This is my artistic statement. And maybe somebody's going to be doing that in the next couple of weeks. There will be people out there pushing that. Or the first graffiti tag, what happens then?
Right, yeah. So in a way, what we're really talking about fundamentally is sort of what is public space? What is, what does it mean when it says public space?
What part of that public space belongs to me?
Right.
And how does my use of it affect your use of it, or your interpretation of what that should be or shouldn't be?
And the corollary of what you just said about how technology and the internet is changing is in a sense, it reasserts the value of the in-person experience, the communing with other people experience.
But I also get a feeling that if you had that at the top of the pyramid, the major pyramid, which is Engine 30, everything would fit underneath that.
Yeah.
I can't think of anything that anybody has pitched that isn't touched by that in some way.
Yeah, and in a way, it's sort of like all three of these projects ultimately become one project because they're actually like a lot of similarities. A lot of the issues are kind of the same, a lot of the things that people are still.
But we will organize it so it is.
Yeah, of course.
Doug, when you say it reasserts the value of physical communion, I think I know what you mean, and I have my ideas on that, but what do you mean by that?
Well, I always hear arts people talk about, the importance of being in the theater, the like this mystical thing. And then when you try and get them to articulate what actually that sort of intangible thing is, they become tongue-tied in a way. They sort of go all mystical on you, or in some way, or whatever. And I think that this technology and community online and the nuances now, there's like all sorts of gradations of how you relate to other people, right? It's that whole idea we were talking about, I think a couple weeks ago, about weak ties, right? Weak tie is if you just like something, and does that actually mean anything? Or if you have 100,000 followers, does that actually mean anything? There are lots of gradations of relationships that you can have with people. And in an odd way, the fact that we now have this, at all these different levels, means that we can be a lot more specific about what the value of that live sort of flesh-on-flesh experience is, which I think we've been not very good about articulating when it comes to culture sometimes. Although we all recognize the value of it, right? Being in the same room is really important.
Well, as you're saying, it's flesh on flesh, but it's also physically being in a space.
Yeah.
Right? Or it could be physically being with an object, let's say in a museum, a real
Right.
object, you know. So I think each of those experiences is being changed by having so much of our lives lived online.
Yeah, and so when we talk about contested spaces, it's sort of like, you know, you can go all sorts of directions about how do you define space.
Yeah.
I mean, right now, this whole idea of what is our notion of privacy. People are willing to give up unbelievable private information online, so that changes our version of what privacy is,
Right.
or what we want to share with people, their expectations about sharing. Well, that actually is a space in which you share things. So then you start to look at, are there any relationships between that and the physical spaces? You know, is it anachronistic at this point to make a grand park and define what the use is and expect that people are going to go, oh yeah, you know? And yet, you look at cities like New York where if it didn't have Central Park, it would implode.
Yeah.
You know, so it's that, where is that point of public space where we all interact with one another, and how do you make spaces in different gradations and in different, you know, in different sort of spheres, political, physical, cultural. We're fine. We're really
Just being in the same space with someone else doesn't mean that you're interacting with them, right?
Right.
You could be online,
That's right. You can have a shared experience. Yeah.
could or could not.
Yeah. So, Ricky,
Yeah.
finish up with your.
Yeah, just real quickly.
Somebody's getting nervous.
Since 2005, LA County has devoted 1% of their capital budget to sponsoring civic art in public places. And so I think this kind of provides an interesting prism because it is top-down art, and in some ways, there are a lot of things it can't do. I mean, you probably couldn't have an Obama or Mitt Romney sucks mural just paid for by the LA County and get away with it. And so, but it's in all these very small communities and larger communities all over LA County. So I think it's kind of an interesting opportunity to look at if we're going to complain about the government and the public, you know, sector not supporting art, is this what we wanted them to do? Because in this way they are, but that doesn't necessarily mean that fits the artistic aspirations of the community that this public art is in, and frankly, it could potentially be in conflict with some local artists, and you certainly have opportunities for graffiti and repurposing and reclaiming this public space here and there. So I just thought that this list of, I think the program's like 7, 8 years old now, so it might be a good time to look back and see how successful this is and see whether we even want, you know, public sector involved in this stuff.
So percent for art projects go back to 1972, I think. Seattle Arts Commission was the first to do public percent for art. So every public building that was being built had to put aside a piece of its budget, and then they built public art all over. And it's been widely copied all over the country. So many cities have them now. They've been in big decline in the last few years for those reasons that you're articulating. So, so there is a sort of a national context for this, and LA is very late in coming to this game. But you're right, it's sort of interesting to sort of, it is that sort of top-down experience.
An interesting component, just to quickly tack on what you're saying, is that this is a county program, right? And there's a ban on murals in LA City. And so the most organic expression of who Los Angeles is as a city, as a culture, is the mural, and the history of murals. And yet there's a ban on murals. And then there's also these giant advertising billboards that go up on the sides of buildings like in Hollywood for movies and stuff. And it's like this weird interaction of, like, yeah, the county is in full support of this 1%, but the city says, well, no, but you can't do murals. But advertising's okay. I mean, it's such a, that to me is like, can we get all these people in a room and figure this out and
then
fix it?
And then you have the Target billboard in downtown that looks like a mural.
Right.
It's actually like,
Right.
it looks like public art, and it's
Yeah.
really a Target ad.
Yeah.
So City of Murals, but who gets to do the murals?
And the county is
What
actually-
is defined as a mural?
I mean, I've talked to the guy who runs the public art program for the county, and they're pissed off at the city. Because it's like, we can't do anything in the city part of LA County. We can do all this great mural stuff. you know.
Is it that you cannot do murals, or the murals must be sanctioned?
Let's go with that.
I think I read that, you can't do murals on private, like property, is what I was.
Without consent of the owner, you're saying?
Well, no, I think it's banned.
I think I read about that too, because somebody
Yeah.
was making it on a garage or
And then-
something and they.
They're trying to overturn it, I think Jose, one of the Uzar, I think.
Uzar, yeah.
Yeah, he's trying to like figure out a way to overturn it, but there hasn't been a resolution, and it's happened since 2002.
Interesting.
There is a groundswell to change the policy.
Yeah, definitely.
Then we have sort of on the online part, online art activism. Layla?
Oh, yeah, that was, I just got, sort of went down the rabbit hole with that one. The original idea, I wanted to do something with Man Bartlett, who's an online artist. I think, I mean, I've spoken about him before. He just asks people to say where they're from or whatever, and, you know, I'm from Chicago, and he'll put a different color feather on his mannequin or whatever. But I found an article as well where he decided to quit Facebook. And the reason was because all these changes were being made that he didn't approve. So he said, well, you know, I'm done with this. You're infringing my rights or whatever, so
I'm quitting the public
I'm
space.
quitting you. And yeah.
It's Twitter too? Or?
What else? No, not
Just keep
Twitter.
it
Just Facebook. But it's pretty much about the TED talk that we all watched as well, with regards to sort of, I don't know, what the internet is allowing you to see and what it's not allowing you to see. And yeah, I just thought it was interesting because it took him so much time to quit his Facebook account. It's not just